Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. There are some wonderful guests and some wonderful projects to learn about. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Hello and welcome to Explore, Explain. And in this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Sam Parsons to the show. Sam, it's great to see you. For the benefit of everyone out there watching and listening, can you give everyone a brief introduction, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. So I'm Sam Parsons. I am a senior analytics consultant for a Tableau partner called Bistory, which means that I work with our clients to help them visualize their data and to sort of explore their data. And I tend to specialize in applying branding to the work that we do.
Super. Well, it's great to have you on this show. And in this episode, we are going to dissect the design story behind a project you worked on in 2021 called The Rivers of Time, about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, for the benefit of everyone out there, especially the listeners who can't see it right now, can you give people a quick overview of what this project's about and kind of what form it takes?
Yeah, sure. So the project was built for a Tableau competition called the Iron Viz. And that had a topic of Viz what you love. And so I chose Marvel films because all of my family love the Marvel films. And as you said, it's called The Rivers of Time. So I was looking at different elements around the Marvel films and the movies. So looking into the different scenes that happened in the films and how they interlinked, character screen time, and the diverse sort of nature and the time that they've had on screen, and to sort of talk about how it looks visually. It's very sort of minimal, sort of presented, muted sort of colours, and it's got a main sort of feature piece, which is sort of a winding river that starts in the top left and winds and tapers down to sort of the bottom right, and that is the piece that is looking at the different scenes in the different films and how they all interlink together.
That is The River of Time, indeed. So you said this was a contest, and the Iron Viz is a heavy-duty contest that people increasingly take part in and invest so much time, effort and energy. Viz what you love. Were there any other things that you love that you may have vizzed had it not been this one?
That's interesting, because when the topic came out and they released the topic, I immediately thought of this because I had the data set already. Right. So with the Iron Viz competition, you have a month. You have to go and source your data set, explore it, and create something. So anything you can save time on in that right. month window, you can spend more about presenting that data and searching it. So I already had a data set, and I thought this could be the perfect thing, because I've had it for a few months and I hadn't been able to sort of crack how to visualize it. So I didn't actually think of anything else. I immediately thought of that. And it's one of those internal sort of pressure things. I like to compete in the Iron Viz competitions. I've done it before, but I don't have that pressure to say I have to absolutely do it this time. So it was a case, I'm going to look at this data set that I've got. If I can get somewhere, then great. If not, then it's not to be.
And just on the note of the contest, I mean, obviously it's a big abstraction of your time and effort on this beyond the day job, and for everyone else taking part in that. What do you get out of that experience? Because it seems to me that so much of it is about your own time spent just testing out new techniques, experimenting, showcasing. It's not necessarily that you're in it to win it, although you, of course, would like to. But it seems to be more of a really nice sort of practice ground just to sort of push the boundaries. Is that a fair comment?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's how we look at it in the Tableau community. And that's how we try to encourage new people to come in to do the competition as well, because you could quite easily look at some of the Iron Viz entries and go, that's just beyond what I'm capable of. I'm not going to do it. But you get so much from competing and spending that month into your process of exploring that data. You'll find new techniques. In this particular piece, I've created something that people hadn't really seen before. I tested myself. with my own like knowledge of maths and radials and you, even if you don't learn a new technique, you'll learn something about how you approach big projects and how you manage your own time that you put to those projects. Because I've had projects where I've tried to do this in the month and I've failed because I've got bogged down in certain elements.
Right.
So I've learned from that in the past how to manage, you know, what parts are important in terms of the project timeline, and how you can speed through sort of or not get bogged down in certain elements. So definitely you get a lot out of doing these competitions, and it's not about just winning. Only 3 people go to the final.
Sure.
So we have hundreds that enter each year. So it's not exactly great odds that you're going to win.
Exactly, and the bar is set high. I mean, just looking through the gallery of submissions, you know, these are people's best works, frankly, and you know, it's there's some brilliant stuff out there. And I guess what the community at large benefits from then is these are all Tableau public works. They are all visible, accessible, downloadable to see the inner workings of these. And then you build on those techniques, and you sort of spread the best practice around.
That's the beauty of the Tableau community, is that they share all of that. They open it up to other people to download. It's great.
Correct. Yeah. Now, when we think about the audience for this work, it's a special circumstance given there is a contest. So there is a direct audience in theory in your mind who are the judges, people who may put you forward to be in the last 3. But it's also a passion project because it's about what you love. How do you therefore keep in mind, as you're going through this process, the other end of the equation, the people reading, consuming, interrogating this work at the end? Do you design it for other people, or do you just purely make it something that if it works for me, that's fine, and that'll be a good kind of proxy indicator of how it will succeed with others?
I think there's different ranges in there. In that, first and foremost, I build it for me.
Yeah.
If I'm not enjoying a project, I won't finish it to the end. So this just happens to this topic, Viz What You Love, is going to be a topic that you're going to be interested in, and you're going to want to follow that through. I will build this purely for my own sort of fun. I created this piece to be printed out and to be put on my wall. Right. That was one of my considerations when I was doing it. It wasn't a consideration thinking, well, it would look good in this format for the judges. It was because I wouldn't mind having something, if it turns out well, to put on my wall of my office. Sure. But then you do start factoring in those little elements of what is the judging criteria? Am I hitting those judging criteria? Yeah. But I'm putting things onto this canvas, and I can read it. Can other people read it? I've had comments on prior projects where the font is too small, or it's too stylized, and it's hard to read. So you've got to consider that. And then I didn't quite get to it at the end of this project, but I looked at, when I had a few days left before the submission, I was looking at converting the text into text that could be read by a screen reader. So that accessibility side of it. I didn't get there because I haven't had much experience trying to do that in Tableau, which is the tool that I'm using for this project. But it's very much, I build it for myself. I have one eye on the competition. I have one eye on what other people might like. And it's also the language you're using within explaining things within it to make sure that I'm using correct language and I'm not going to offend anybody when I'm talking about diversity. Yeah, you've got to have all those considerations whilst building it.
That's right. You almost have to be your own kind of gatekeeper of all those different sensitivities and pressures and balances. But I noticed that you also mentioned in one of your Twitter conversations that you test it out with your 8-year-old daughter. Maybe she's no longer 8 years old, but do you find having someone like that who is, old enough to understand some of the content about the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a good testing ground to say, well, if it's understandable and engaging for somebody like that, then hopefully it will also by extension be for other people?
Yeah, so we've been quite relaxed with those movies. We've let our children watch the movies.
Yeah.
We don't find that they have, particularly high bad language or particularly violent. They are violent, but not in a particularly extreme violence or way that movies can be. If you
That's right. Yeah.
I mean. It's not bloody violence.
That's right. Yeah.
So we've let them watch them. So they've got an interest in those films. And so I found it really helpful or really interesting to see, could she understand what I had done? And she did. And she's expressing an interest. And part of it is that I want to include my children in what I do.
Yeah.
I've even had them doing stuff on Tableau, doing their own visualizations.
Fantastic.
So I've had them recording data of cartoons that they've watched, and then they put it into the Tableau. But it was it's partly for the project and partly for involving my children in the work that I do. They know that I work long hours and I do a lot of stuff in Tableau, but they don't really know what Tableau is unless I show it to them. But from the point of the visualization, it's kind of a I don't want to call her this, but a low bar. If she can understand it, then hopefully most other people will be able to pick it up and understand it.
Absolutely. And I think with that, there's clearly a lot of work an audience has to do with this piece of work, sorry. And that's not a bad thing, because not everything can be, should be, will be simple to be immediate and quick. So again, that kind of immediate testing option is very useful, just a sort of sense check. Even if it takes a while to read, do you eventually get to the other side of understanding? So I think having that immediate person to help you with that is always very useful. You spoke about the print output desire of this, and there's an interesting, not so much tension, but there's an interesting sort of juxtaposition there of Tableau, which is inherently a digital tool, primarily for a digital platform that you read it through, but you are making something that is so poster friendly in its style. Did you, in a sense, and we'll speak about more of some of the interactive features later on, did you at any point want to avoid any kind of interactivity to make it purely a Tableau built static printable piece of work that also happened to be consumed on the web and digitally?
Probably not, in the sense that I know that I'm still building this for the competition.
Sure.
It's a Tableau competition. I've got to show off some features that Tableau can do. So it needs a little bit of interactivity there. Otherwise, you don't need to use Tableau. You can use whatever visualization, like Adobe Illustrator or whatever. You could just create a static infographic. But obviously that wouldn't fit the competition rules. It needs to be built in Tableau. For me, I wanted to have a piece that I could just look at and get all the information. I wanted to just create that sort of poster sort of design. So in the defaults, I will have selected things that were interactive, so it shows up nicely in that sort of initial view. But also I didn't put an awful lot of interactivity into this, because the maths behind some of the charts in here is quite hard, and creating interactivity to then adjust that maths and adjust visuals, I don't think I had time to really build that in as well. So
yeah, I can see that. You know, I'm sure that there's lots of rigor in what you've pulled behind the scenes, but also, as you said, some kind of interactive intervention can quickly topple that very kind of carefully constructed mathematics. So yeah, that makes sense. We'll come on to the design choices later on, but I'm just thinking about your own perhaps imposed restrictions. It's as you mentioned in the introduction there, it's a very muted tone of voice. It's a very kind of calm, kind of graceful color scheme. Is that a kind of a house style? Is that a signature style that you prefer to work towards? Is it something that you wanted to just almost impose on this particular piece? Because there's no design restrictions coming from the contest itself, so it's it's down to your choices. But what was the think about your planned or intended sort of tone of voice?
Okay, so I quite pride myself in trying different styles with my work. I don't stick to the one sort of thing that works for me and then I just repeat it. I try different things. I'll try bold colors, I'll try muted colors, I'll try different layouts. For this particular piece, I took inspiration from the visualizations around the time, which was all around COVID, and the FT charts that were coming out from John Byrne Murdoch and those. So I was taking that sort of style from those and that inspiration. What I didn't want to do was, with the Marvel theme, because they're so closely linked to comic books, and you have that association, a lot of Marvel sort of visualization based things are very comic in the way they're displayed. They're big, bold, they have lots of character pictures in them, and it's very sort of standard in the way that people approach that visualization. I didn't want that for this. I wanted to try and get a more editorial sort of viewpoint across, saying, yes, it is Marvel, but it's actually a serious piece of work here, and I want to really sort of dive into this in a serious way. And so I wanted to present it in that way, and I thought, what better than take some inspiration from the FT and those COVID charts. So I took the color from the backgrounds of those charts, I put that into this background. And then I started off going, right, okay, so what colors could I associate with Marvel characters? Reds and blues are the obvious ones from the characters. So your Captain Americas, your Iron Mans, and people like that, Spider-Man. So that kind of links. And then I just wanted to not have too many colors. So I tried to reduce the palette down and make it sort of cohesive so it all works together.
So you said that, and it is evident in the style that there's clearly inspiration from the likes of the FT, of the slightly sort of faded salmon pink background, and the sort of it looks to me sort of like 80% black, kind of dark greys in use. Were there any other pieces that you drew inspiration from? And actually, I said both inspiration in terms of both things that you might seek to emulate, but also maybe things to avoid. I mean, you've said already that you want to avoid the standard comic strip or very vivid color approach, but any other visual methods that were out there that you felt, yeah, maybe I could draw from there? Because you do mention inspiration from a couple of people in terms of both the techniques, but also the visuals.
Yeah, so I'm always inspired by a lot of people, lots of visualization designers, not just in the Tableau community. So the Nadia Bremers of the world, the piece with the sweeping river of time, that main sort of big visual as part of this, that's very much sort of looking towards her work, and it fans out at one end with the arcing lines coming in from this sort of fan effect. And there's a number of pieces that she does that I've taken inspiration from. I've tried emulating some of her work before. It's the people of that ilk that I look to and go, is there stuff? It's just getting ideas from them,
of course,
and that inspiration and trying to apply it here. That's probably the biggest source of inspiration, is people like her and Valentina, and I'm going to probably ruin her name, but Valentina de Filippo. You know, those designers really sort of inspire me, and if I can repeat that sort of stuff using Tableau, then I feel that I'm doing well.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think it's in some cases people feel, I often think, reluctant to be inspired by others because there's a sense of, I don't want to be not accused of plagiarizing, but I want to kind of come up with my own ideas. But most things have been done, and there's no harm being inspired by other things. And if you've gone so far as to really emulate something almost, you know, mark by mark, then just credit that reference and credit that inspiration. But yeah, we can all build on each other's work, and that's something that I think, you know, is something to be encouraged, not to be dissuaded. So the last thing just to mention in terms of the sort of the background context of the work, you mentioned the timescale of a month. I mean, how do you reflect on how you used your time? And I know that you talked about a rough estimate of about 80 hours of time that you invested, which is not just Tableau time, it's thinking time. But how do you reflect on that sort of time span? And would you have benefited from any more time, or did you just use what you had?
I think I put into it all the spare time that I had available in that month. So I was working in the evenings. I have a day job. I have a family. I wasn't able. I'm not going to let my sort of fun visualization works, because that's what this is. It's not paying any bills or anything. I'm not going to let that impact my family time. So I'd have to make sure the children were in bed before then. I could then take myself away in an evening and apply myself. Same on the weekends. So that's where I spent all my time. Would I have spent, I think I spent it effectively. It got to the point when I was getting close to the deadline that it needed to be submitted, and I was just tweaking little elements here and there and moving things pixel by pixel. And I'm just like, no, stop, just enough is enough. You're done. And so I think I was done with a few days spare. I was lucky though, in that the last week of the submission deadline, I was between new jobs. I'd finished an old job and I had a week before starting my new job. So I literally had that time, and I had planned in that time to review stuff, so basically had it mostly built with that week spare to then go back through and just check that things are working and there's no errors or issues. And I think I did use my time effectively. Would I have done more? Could I have done more? I probably could have, but I'm happy with what I've done. I don't think there's nothing that other than that part where I mentioned about the accessibility of the text, there's nothing that I regret not putting into it. There's nothing I feel that was missing. It was just that element that would have, I think, is important and would be nice to build into the work. I just haven't found it particularly easy to do in Tableau.
Yeah. And that's the judgment we have to make, I guess, when we get to that finish line, which is there anything missing? Is there anything included that should be missing because we need to take it out? Or is there anything that's included that we need to do differently? And it's, again, when you've got this situation of very much a self-motivated project, you don't have necessarily that external stakeholder to give you that clarity of stop, finished, leave that in, take that out. So you have to have that sort of almost your own distance from the work to have that kind of critical edge, and it is very difficult.
Although you could view the judges as that external stakeholder, knowing that, okay, what are they going to be looking for?
You know,
is every element really playing towards what they're going to want to see? You know, it's that balance. Is it for me or is it for the competition? And it's that sort of keep that in mind right at the end. Is it flowing? Does it work, you know, in terms of what they will be judging it against?
Now, you mentioned that you already had the data set for this project, or some data about this project at least. As a process person, are you typically somebody will go straight into the data and do some charting and explore it, or do you pick up a pen and paper, sketch some ideas that are in your head, maybe grab a tablet and do some sketching? What's your kind of entry point into these things?
It's interesting because the way I work because I use Tableau in my day job, and the way you work in your day job is you get into the data and you explore the data to see what is in there. That's kind of how I approach this. So it's quite tricky because I will use pen and paper and sketch things separately to projects to just put ideas down. It's almost like a book of just ideas that I could potentially use on a project, not necessarily having any in particular project, but particular projects in mind. I have that in a book of just sketches, like you know, sweeping lines, and this could be this could be that sort of thing. So I have that to draw inspiration from as well. But in this terms of this was very much, I needed to see the form of the data, because as I said, I had the data a while ago and I struggled to visualize it. So I already had some sense of the data when I started this project for the IMVis competition. And the form of the data has kind of led the design of the what I've ended up with, and I expect we'll probably go through that later on. But it's very much, I didn't draw anything out. This is not an end product that I had sketched out at the beginning. I didn't know where I was going to end up with it.
Right.
So it's very much, I was looking in, I'd had the data set, I had pulled it into Tableau, and then I started playing around with it to see sort of just like I keep saying, the form of the data, so sort of the frequency of the marks when you pull them onto the worksheets and you're building it out, and it sort of gives you ideas on how then best can you visualize that setup of the way the data is coming through.
And clearly there's a lot of background work gone into the mathematics and the formulae that are kind of shaping up the eventual representations. And I don't think we need to get into the weeds of every single aspect of that. And I'm sure you don't want to revisit a lot of that anyway. But just in terms of the sort of original data set that you did have, could you briefly describe the sort of the shape and the dimensions? I mean, we're talking about 23 movies over a period of time, which I can't remember exactly the number of years that they've been going, but it's maybe 10, 15 years or so. I mean, what kind of data values did you have for each movie?
So the original data came from a tweet from somebody called Tony Goldmark. And he had put some time in to understand the timing of where each scene started and ended for each movie and put them in order. And he tweeted that in a series of images. And at the time, I thought that could be quite fun to visualize. So I saved those images onto my computer, and I basically copied those into Excel. And it was very basic. It was just literally the movie, the scene name or number, and then a starting point and an end point for minutes in that movie. And that was literally it that I had to start with. And I just typed those all into Excel, because it's just a nice, easy tool to use in that instance. And that was the starting point. What I found, though, when trying to visualize it, there was a lot of gaps in what he had tweeted, in that there was no, he would tweet to say, this scene until the end of the movie. And you're like, well, where is the end?
Right, okay, yeah.
So I ended up having to watch the movies to say, right, okay, so that's this scene, yeah, it starts where he says.
Yeah.
And then when does it actually finish in terms of a timestamp? And then there'll be in what he had tweeted, end credits. And that would be it. And you're like, okay, well, when did the end credits start? How long did they go on for?
Yeah.
So I had to sort of watch all the movies and fill in those gaps. So even though it sounds like quite laborious, it's quite fun, because I quite like watching movies anyway, and I'm like filling it in, watching the movies, got my laptop on my lap. And then from that point, I had a base sort of set of data then I can bring into Tableau and see what else do I need to bring in terms of dimensions that might help me. What can I layer onto this?
But as you're watching, sorry to interrupt, but as you're watching these movies back, are you then getting tempted to collect a little bit more, or this was a fight scene, or this was a scene of kind of exposition or whatever?
I was very tempted in that when in that interactivity piece of hovering on a particular mark in the end product, the viz, you would hover onto a scene and then it might explain what the scene was. But then I didn't have that originally, and then I thought, that's going to take a lot of my time to go through, and I'm not sure I want to spend my time and what added value. That would probably just be for the real fans of the movies, that they might want to get those little nuggets of information. So I guess going back to your previous question, that might be something that I might look to have layered on if I had more time, because that would have been a nice little touch to say, you hover on this scene is a fight between so and so and so and so. But a lot of the call outs in this river of time is showing that large parts of the movies actually start and end in a continuous piece, a continuous scene, as it's termed in this visualization. So like 90% of the movie is just shot without being interrupted by any other scene.
Sequential,
yeah. So yeah.
Now, when it comes to as we said, the mathematics of how you turn a lot of the data that you've collected and prepare it for its eventual use in Tableau. I mean, to me, again, without going into too many details, to me, that's a task that is unknowable at the start in terms of how much you're going to have to do. And it's something that's very much an iteration between you do something, does this work? Do something else, does that look better? And it seems to be something that runs all the way down towards almost the end of the process. And I often think that people perhaps, they do the data stage, they kind of become familiar with the data resource, and then they move on to charts, and they almost abandon the thought that there's going to be more data work that continues, but it goes all the way to the end, right?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. This was very cyclical in the way that it worked, because I didn't know what my end visualization was going to be. I was still, as I was creating that mathematics to manipulate the data and manipulate the visual, I was, as you saying, seeing, does it work? Is it better than what it was previously? And then I'd go back into the data, change the maths or add on a bit more maths, and then come back into Tableau. How does that look? It was very cyclical. It was very much exactly as you said it. And in terms of this river of time, it started very linearly from left to right across the screen. And then I wanted, this is where I was talking about the form of the data. I wanted to show how long each scene was, but some scenes were dominating the length that I had to show everything. The other scenes became so minute you couldn't even see that they were there.
Right.
So I was then looking at a way to, how can I stretch this out but not take up a massive part of the screen or the whole visual, the whole width of the piece. So this is where I started then looking to bend this around radial to see, does it help if it goes around 360 degrees? It did a little bit, and then something hit me and said, can I bend it round 2 lots of 360 degrees? Which sounds like a spiral, but something in my head said, well, I could bend it round, and then I could bend it round the other way. And then I started coming up with this sort of oscillating wave sort of motion. And so then I was basically spreading the marks out across twice the distance. And it was that sort of process, and going back into the maths, going, right, okay, I've just done this bit of trigonometry. Now I need to duplicate it or stretch it over not 360 degrees, but 720 degrees.
Right.
How do I do that?
So
I'm not even good at maths. I've got a whiteboard that's next to my screen here, and I was drawing so many like diagrams of and looking up like the old trigonometry equations on Google. I was just looking them up, going, right, sure, it's this, and I'm just trying to do it as I go.
I think there's two things there. First of all, what's interesting, especially from a process point of view, is that what we ultimately see in this, centerpiece river of time seems to have emerged out of a desire to not give it too much space. And therefore what we see is in a sense, the trade-off to fit it into less space, but obviously it creates a whole new challenge, but a whole new creative option as well. But secondly, I think there's something interesting there about what you said about mathematics. Clearly, you know enough to know what to look for. And I think one of the things about data viz skills and the repertoire skills that one needs to be the best at all these things, which very few people can or will be, is you don't really need to have mastery of any of these subjects all the time. It's more just, in my view, a sense of, do I know what to look up? Do I know that what I need to look up now is some geometric calculation of the area of a circle, or some trigonometry? So how do you calculate radials? I mean, radians, you won't use that in more than about 1% of your projects, but it's just having that foraging skills, almost the Googling skills, to know therefore what to research.
Absolutely. My background is I did an engineering degree, but I wasn't very good at it. So I never ever followed it through to the end. I did a product design degree, which was run by the engineering faculty. So we did a lot of modules in that degree around thermodynamics and robotics and things, stuff that I knew enough to scrape by and end up with a degree. I didn't get a high degree, but I think it's that sort of background. I do know a little bit about sort of mathematics and logic and all this stuff that gets me so far, as you say. And I'm also very stubborn in that if I see that other people can do it, and I'm like, well, why can't I? I can do that if I just apply myself, and just not accept that I'm going to be defeated by this. I can get there, and that's kind of how it was hard, but I didn't put the pressure on myself to get to the end point. I have to absolutely submit for this competition. Can I get it done? If I don't meet the deadline, and I'm still working on it, I'll still work on it, and it'll just not be part of the competition. But absolutely. It was,
and I think a key point there, and it's not a comment about this project, but in any project, in a sense, it doesn't really matter how inelegant the workings are behind the scenes, or the code, or the script, or the solutions. If it works, it works. Now, it's a different matter if that has to be a reproducible thing, and it may not therefore have the kind of long-term robustness again. But if it does the job for what you need it to do, that's all that matters ultimately. Now, just a last couple of points about the data. When you were doing some of the explorations, did you have any aha moments of, right, that's the thing I'm going to do? And equally, did you have any other discoveries along the way, any other charts that spoke to you about something that didn't ultimately make it in, or at least the analysis didn't make it into the final piece?
In terms of an aha moment, it was probably around how I was thinking about visualizing these scenes interlinking. So I started off with Gantt charts, and so as you would naturally think, you have your movies and the Gantt line for how long the scenes were in those particular movies, but they weren't interlinking. And I had an aha moment when I thought about, could I show, instead of necessarily the length of each of those scenes from all of the movies, could I show how the timeline is jumping between the movies for each scene? And then I started looking at bump charts. So it's this scene is this movie, the next scene is at this movie, then it's back again. It was that it was the big aha. I might be onto something here, because that's essentially what this time river is. Is it's a bump chart moving around a radial, going from, there's I don't know, 23 bands within this, and it's jumping from each of those bands as each scene from each movie appears in the whole overall timeline. So that was definitely the big sort of aha moment.
So almost you switched it from, in a sense, looking at movies as the primary dimension, and switching it to, well, what's the story? And where does that happen to end up being in the movies? Like inverting the thing, really.
Yeah, very much that. And then I started looking at, well, in that bump chart, could I then add back in the Gantt sort of element of, okay, we're now on this movie line. How long does it stay on that movie line before we move on to the next one? But that's where the form of the data wasn't really helping me. It was too cramped. So I just kept it to a sort of a bump chart going back and forth. In terms of analyses that I haven't included that I thought I could do, I don't think that there's nothing jumping out of me from memory that there was stuff that I really wanted to include, but I didn't have space. I think I made the most of the space that I had and what I wanted to include in the data that I had collected. Obviously, the large part of it was spent on this sort of main visual, and then it was building around that. So I then collected data on screen time and stuff, and came up with some ideas on how to represent those. So I don't think there was anything particularly that I didn't include that I thought would have helped.
Yeah, well, and that's, I think, going back to your reflection of the use of your time, I think that's something that we can be satisfied with, saying, yeah, there's nothing that I left out. There was no tension that I feel, if only I could have just found a way or a space to include that. We can sometimes, make our peace with that sort of process. So we'll come on to some of the more intricate details of this centerpiece Time River in a second, but let's sort of kind of work through the contents now of the main graphic sort of sequentially. So we are looking at a large sort of landscape layout, and you kind of read down, then across, then across, then across in sort of these column structures. Now, just to begin with the sort of bigger picture, we are looking at the primary focus of elements of time. So you've got the time as a core theme. You also have this additional perspective, which is issues around diversity. And again, just from the point of view of your own, I guess, editorial choices, what made you feel that which is kind of a departure from the central plot of Time, was worth exploring, including in this particular piece of work?
Yeah, I think it's been sort of asked of me before, in the sense of, could I have just done that main centerpiece and just left it at that? In terms of so for the competition rules, you're looking at getting scored on storytelling, analysis, and design. So for me, there needs to be more than just a single visual for storytelling. So I was looking to build out on the theme of time, and so I just felt that we were looking at sort of more high level at each movie and the scenes, and then we were moving on to the characters and the time that they had, and then let's move into a little bit more depth into those characters. What's the diverse nature of those characters? Because at the time, what we call phase 4, which was the next set of movies, hadn't started, but there was a lot of talk around how Marvel has recognized that the first set of movies, that first 23, weren't the most diverse in terms of their lead characters and the screen time that they had. So I wanted to show that, and show how in the more recent movies have they actually started pulling in more diverse characters. So I wanted to end on that sort of piece in terms of the story that flowing through from the time and going down through those levels. I wanted to end on something a bit more significant than this is just the movies.
This is where we are.
Yes. Yeah. I wanted to end on something a bit more significant around the time that diverse characters have had on screen, and have Marvel recognized and responded to feedback, and which they have. So that's kind of the sort of the thinking around it, was is to build it out and go further into the detail of the movies without with essentially the data that I could get hold of, essentially.
So if we look for the contents then, and just sort of briefly on the sort of first column, where we've got 2 sections looking at the brief history of Marvel Studios. And I'm thinking of you as a storyteller now. Obviously, you feel that you need to establish the backstory, the context of Marvel and what Marvel's about and the history. So again, you've used some line charts, a kind of an area chart there. Just again, sort of briefly, just sort of describe your thinking for that sort of scene setter to open with.
Well, yeah, it's exactly that. It is the scene setter. So Disney had acquired Marvel Studios, and I wanted to just give a nod to what was happening there around that time, that Disney wasn't particularly flourishing around that time in terms of its movies. Whereas Marvel was just starting to kick off. I think they had just done Iron Man 1, which was a huge hit. And I wanted to look at those, essentially the stocks of those companies, to see how were they performing against each other. And then what happened to Disney's stock after they acquired Marvel. And then obviously they produced all of these extra movies, and their stock has just skyrocketed. But they obviously had that foresight that Marvel was doing something good here, and they wanted to get in on that. I wanted to set that scene. I wanted just something to just kick off for the whole piece around the cinematic universe.
Yeah.
The note on the time travel, which is underneath it, that kind of just didn't really fit anywhere else.
Right.
I wanted to include. I'll be honest here. It was kind of the only place that I could really fit it in.
Yeah.
So if people know the movies, and they know there's the movies interlink, obviously, and then there's a big Avengers movie at the end, which is called Endgame. And within that movie, they do some time travel. I wanted to include it somewhere because it's a big sort of end piece of that 23 films, but I couldn't really sort of figure out where to put that. So it just kind of fitted in this place, which, you know, it was kind of just here. I'm acknowledging that this has happened.
Yeah,
it's to do with time as well. So I thought it'd be interesting to sort of visualize that, but I couldn't really place it anywhere else easily.
Well, I think it does work. Again, in terms of the sort of setting the scene of the subject matter, but also there's just a little sort of explaining, because, you know, these things are sometimes very complex to wrap your head around. And I learned something from that graphic, just to kind of get my own head around how all these things fit together. So again, I think it makes a lot of sense to do that, because then as we move over, we are into this centerpiece Time River. Now, you've already spoken about some of the background reasons for why we end up with this, you know, this sort of shift in beat. Now, I know that you mentioned it wasn't based on this, but I still look at this and think of, I don't know what the correct term is. In one of the movies, when there's a big battle in New York, there's these huge flying monstrous alien ships. I'm out of my depth already here. And it reminded me of that, the kind of flowing big thing. I guess you weren't thinking of trying to emulate any of the forms or shapes of any of these things that we see in the movie itself.
I wasn't, no, not
maybe it's a byproduct.
No.
Slight
little. I think that's a nice, and you know, a nice byproduct, definitely. But just sort of as I'm thinking of it, we were talking about the time travel piece. I need remembering the sort of thinking around that. I needed to separate that out from the flow of the scenes, because the scenes were very linear in terms of when they happened with what movie. Yeah. It wasn't going to deal with that time travel piece of, okay, this scene now appears way back into the past. I was never sort of going to try and really call that out, obviously, within that Time River. So I wanted to call that out separately. But yeah, in terms of the design of the Time River, I think that's just a byproduct, and it's a nice one if that's what you get from it.
Absolutely. And I mean, you've already kind of described the kind of essence of what this looks like. We've got the kind of the phases of the movies, and each one has this individual strand that almost creates one of the metaphors that struck me was almost like a music score, this sense of all these different lines that kind of give you a sense of pitch. And then we've got this general sense of a flow, again, as you've explained, to kind of, if anything, just fit into the page and all the screen dimension. And then we've got this, as you said, a kind of a bump chart that joins together the sequential chronological story bouncing across different movies. Now, along the way, you've got these little sort of spin-off displays. You've got these little stacked dots, as well as these little icons, which kind of form almost a donut chart, pie chart. Can you just speak to what those are? And also the work that you put in to create these little icons for the movies.
Yeah, sure. So, okay, so the icons, because of the nature of the competition, I don't own any of like any official iconography or the logo for Marvel Studios. I can't include that in the competition. Okay, so I had to create my own icons using Illustrator based off of stuff I've seen on the web. So I've taken inspiration, and I've had to literally create every icon for each film of my own design. So that was then able to be brought into the visualization and as part of the competition. Those sort of, essentially they're unit charts sort of coming out. And what they're doing is they're displaying how long each scene is. So they're pointing from the major scene or the major length of scene from each movie. So there's 23 of them that are spiking out from the winding river. So each of those has a dot that represents, I can't remember, it might be 5 minutes of the scene. So the longer the longer length of dots, then the longer the scene it is. And at the end of that is essentially a donut chart, like you said, and that is representing the percentage of that particular movie that scene takes up. So
right.
I think the first one is, I think it might be Captain America, and I think that says that it's 94% of the movie happens in that one sort of scene or length of scenes that goes together. So that's kind of, I was saying I was struggling with the form of the data to say, when this scene is from this movie and it stays on this movie for such a length of time, I couldn't do that Gantt sort of stay on this and represent it on this line for that length, because it was really sort of cramping the other scenes that were particularly short. So I ended up doing the bump chart, and then I needed to show the length of those scenes in a different way. So I actually sort of double encoded that with, I have got bubbles on the Gantt chart that's sort of showing that. It was just sort of a bit of an interest. Could I do it and do the other part? And then I had these dot plots or unit charts sort of spiking out that ended in a bit more detail as to what that was showing. But
I think that also helps to focus the eye, Sam. I think, you know, having that bubble helps to sort of say, right, here's where these dots kind of point to. So I think the double encoding absolutely works. In fact, I think it would be inferior for not having it.
Yeah, I've even put little almost like grid lines coming from those dot plots to those bubbles across the across the river. So just to try and help visually connect it up, make it easy to follow. And I think it worked, and it was tricky to work out where to place them. So I was trying to place those unit charts coming from the main river on the how to describe this. If you're imagining it bending around, the sort of the outer part of the bend,
yes,
they're coming from those parts rather than the inner part, because you've got more space on the outer side than the inner side.
That's right. It's the kind of convex side rather than the concave side. Yes.
Yeah. So it was then trying to work out, okay, so I'm now on this part of the bend, so it needs to come out from this point rather than go in from the other side. And again, back into the maths to try and get that to work. And I think it's visually striking, and I think it works, and I think it's not too crowded as well. And that was one of the, well, yeah, we'll get into it. Go on.
But I think with that, I think there's something that seems to be quite favorable in the data shape, in that these, you know, these kind of annotated charts that fly off, they don't clash spatially, thankfully. You're not having to make any compromise, you're not having to make some rather sort of cumbersome adjustment. They do sort of fit together pretty well, thankfully, due to this kind of angles that you've created.
Yeah, and a lot of how I've positioned the chart. So the chart, when it was built, it was originally going across the screen, waving across the screen. What I did was I twisted it 45 degrees so that naturally within a square, you would have areas at the top. In this case, it's waving from the top left to the bottom right. You naturally have spaces in the top right and the bottom left where you can put annotations.
That's right.
And that's the consideration that for twisting it also makes it look a bit cooler if it's twisted rather than horizontally.
Yeah.
But I felt that it gave me more space to put text and copy around what was there.
That's right. And that's a really important choice where we think about charts having a spatial consequence. It's not just the space that it uses up, it's the space that it leaves behind in a residual sense to then house labels and whatever, and also to give moments of emptiness to breathe and to let things just sort of be settled for a while. I think it's important. Now, as we move across, I'll come on to the explainer in a short while. Just moving on though to the next section about screen time. Now we've got a really interesting chart here about the character time. It looks like a kind of vertical stream graph. Excuse me. Would that be a fair?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So this is one of the more interactive parts of the piece, where we have a list of the main characters. I think there's about 30 main characters that I've listed there that you're able to select on and select multiples of. And the stream chart is just running chronologically the films, and as you select on characters, they're added to the stream chart and they have their own little stream, and you can see where those characters, or what films those characters that you've selected, where they feature together, and who had more screen time in those in a comparison. So that's where I felt that a stream chart was actually quite good for that. It also sort of visually sort of comes along with the rivers and the whole theme of it, which is another reason I chose it. And I did look at stacked bars and area charts to do this, but it just wasn't really working for me to show the proportion of who had more. So it's got a center line to it, and you can quite easily see when you select there's two characters on a movie who's had more, because they move over that middle point. And I even put a shadowing behind it for the extremes, for all those. If you were to select all those 30 characters, they would fill up to that point of the shadowing. Yeah. So then you can sort of see where most of the characters featured towards the end of the movies, to the Avenger movies, where obviously they all come together in the big sort of end piece for Marvel. And yeah, so visually I thought, for what I wanted it to do and have a little bit of fun, interact with it, find something out, it does what I wanted it to.
Absolutely, and that's the perfect use case for a stream graph, where you've got lots of concurrent things happening, and it's not so much what's the size of this at any given point, it's more the flow, the ebb and the flow, and with that it's also the emptiness when somebody's not in a movie, which also is revealing. And sometimes you expect that, and other times you think, oh, I'm surprised they weren't much in that movie.
Yeah, and it's you select on a character and you find that they've actually not featured for another 10 movies until they come back again. Yeah, I didn't realize it was that long since.
That's right. Obviously we've got a vertical stream graph. Did you consider a horizontal, sort of left to right chronological one?
I did, but for the labeling of the films, it worked far easier if it was vertical, because then the labels for the films are horizontal and it's easier to read.
Absolutely right. I agree with that. Jumping down, we've got a bunch of factoids, which are just sort of labels, nothing in terms of visual treatment beyond the styling of those. And then we've got another sort of bump chart, which shows the time in the MCU showcase. Once again, you just sort of speak to the thinking behind that chart and the analysis that it shows.
Yeah, so that bottom chart was it was looking at the top 10 characters, and it was looking into the actual Avenger movies, and I was just interested to see, in terms of screen time, which characters featured the most in those particular movies. And I think, I can't remember which one I've called out, but there was some characters in the third Avengers film that just didn't appear at all. They just sort of disappeared, even though they were quite major in the other films. I can't remember if it might have been Iron Man that I've called out on the actual end visualization, where they were second. They had the second most screen time in the first couple of movies. Right. Then didn't feature at all, or featured very little in the third movie, and then they came back to feature again. It was just from a fan's point of view, it was just an interesting sort of take who was featured. You you can select that and see. You can select any of those marks, and it will highlight and show where those characters that you've selected. It was just I guess it was taking that screen time and just looking at those Avenger movies where they all come together, really.
But I think it also reveals, I mean, it's not just about the use of the characters in the story, but it's also just from a bigger picture view of the movie industry, the difficulty in securing a character and the actor behind that character over a decade, 15 years, and sort of the continuity demands of that. I mean, it's actually amazing that we're able to see the same performers throughout this story, in a sense.
It's It's fantastic, and it's no wonder that at some point they had to call time on that and
exactly.
Yeah, I've had enough. And,
yeah,
and
please
now,
kill me.
now they're going through the same. I think they're trying to go through the same process now, starting a new phase and bringing in new characters that they'll eventually. I imagine they'll look for that same.
That's right.
Box office hit.
Yeah, exactly.
Bringing them all together in a big movie and let's make a lot of money from it.
Absolutely. And then into the last column, we've got the diversity stories here. So we've got the first analysis or first chart is a sort of stat bar, a pair of stat bar looking at the split gender-wise and race-wise, and then a more sort of jitter plot. I think the Tableau world calls these sort of spread out distributions of dot plots, looking at the sort of gender and race matters in focus. Again, just from the point of view of the chart choices there, especially, what was the sort of the process that led you to land on those?
Yes, so the two stacked bars at the top was just looking at, for each film, overall, what was the proportion of screen time from male or female characters, or white or BAME characters, and just showing how I wanted to see if, as the films became more recent, if that proportion was increasing. So were Marvel starting to recognize in the more recent movies that they need more diverse characters in there? And there is a little bit of that. There's a couple of outliers where they have I think Captain Marvel, the movie with Brie Larson, who's the major character and takes up the vast majority of that movie screen time. I think she was the first female lead in one of the Marvel movies, but that came probably, I don't know, about 18 films in before they had a female lead in that movie. So I wanted to sort of show that in that case, and I thought this sort of stacked bar worked. So it was either are they diverse or are they not? And then sort of more in focus, you've got a number of icons that you can select and choose a film, and then you can see all the characters within that film. So it's just going that level further into it, and then you can see all the characters in those films, who's had the most time. You can see it overall, or you can go and select an icon and it will filter those down. So you can see essentially, like you said, it's essentially a jitter plot, which is a dot plot just spread out. And you can see who's had a bit more time. And there's Gantt, not Gantt, box plots, box and whisker plots above, just to show the spread, the
summary of it.
I guess I'm trying to get a little bit of analysis points in the judgment for putting some box and whisker charts in there, but absolutely. It was still quite interesting, and there is some interesting stories that you could probably find in there by playing with it and interacting with it.
Absolutely.
But yeah,
and I mean, we've spoke therefore in going this process about the kind of composition, the architecture of the sequencing, which I think is relatively self-explanatory. And I like how you've kind of got this general layout of a kind of a top title region that's separate then from the content. And then at the bottom, we've got all these important footnotes and little explainers. And I just want to sort of focus on that explanatory side, because I think it's a signature style of your work and something that I really admire of your work, Sam, where you are very careful to talk and walk people through everything, what they're seeing, how to read it, what it all means. And you know, one of the centerpieces of this that does that is the explainer for the Time River. And I wondered, do you sometimes do that for yourself as much as anything else, to remind yourself?
It's not to remind myself. I do that. Certainly, that center explainer is done for the thought process that I'm going to end up printing this. It's not going to be an interactive thing that I can click on something to bring something up to explain how to do something, or hover on this mark, it'll tell me what it is. When it's printed, all the information needs to be on the screen. So I need to be able to explain what are we looking at in as succinct a way as possible. So that's why I do that. It's not just, and this goes back to the start of the conversation where you're saying, where you asked, am I doing this for me or other people? Certainly these elements are for other people, because I could quite easily just drop that River of Time in and I know exactly what's going on there. But for somebody else to pick it up and enjoy it and read it, I need to add these elements in. And I think it's a crucial part. And in terms of the header, the footer with the little footnotes, that was a very much an exploration in a sort of editorial style. If you notice in the actual overall visualization, against charts or against sections, I've got little numbers that I'm just calling out, and then under the footnote under that section, you've got the same number and explaining where that data has come from or explaining what that chart is. And it was something I wanted to build in. So in the footnote, I've even got things that are explaining how did I come to this design of this river. I've explained it in a series of slides which you can open up. I guess what it is I guess I wanted to build something that was completely well-rounded, that people can pick up without having to speak to me to understand what's going on.
I need to watch this video. I'll listen to this podcast.
Absolutely. It's all there.
That's it. I mean, these things need to operate in the wild when you're not present to explain things. So
yeah, I think it's helped it to land better as well. I think people appreciate doing that. And also, even from a competition point of view, it could just be viewed as showing off, doing these fancy chart types.
Yeah.
When necessarily I could show it they might think I could show it in a small standard chart type, the same data. Well, I wanted to also put in there to explain why did I come to these? Why am I using a stream chart rather than a stacked bar? Well, it's for these reasons. Put that in there. It's the only chance I get from a competition point of view as well, to have my say to the judges.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point as well. Now, I guess an extension of that is recognition. Again, if we kind of step back from the piece, there's a lot of writing happens in DataVis. There's a lot of words, a lot of text. And that can take a significant amount of time, not just to come up with what you need to write, but then the editing and the kind of language style and usage. But it also needs to be styled, typeface choices, fonts. What's your process or choice making that goes into selecting a typeface and therefore fonts within a piece like this?
I do a lot of the design in Adobe Illustrator. So I'll be building this out in Tableau, and I'll be taking screenshots and bringing it into Adobe Illustrator. Right. Then I'll be looking at, so for people that are listening or watching that don't know Tableau too well, Tableau, when you put things onto Tableau Public, has an issue around what fonts it can display. Right. There's a limited list of web safe fonts that you can actually display using Tableau itself. So the fonts that you're applying on charts are limited, whereas what you'll find with people that are doing stuff on Tableau Public, they'll bring in images of the text, which they have stylized or created more interesting stylistic fonts using Figma or Illustrator. And that's kind of where I went with this. And I bring it into Illustrator, and then I'll have maybe a chart, or maybe I've got an early copy of this River of Time, and then I'm looking to get, I'm trying to think editorially. I don't want it to look too stylistically cartoon. Yes. What fonts can I use that will look professional, but slightly interesting? I think my font choice was a font called Oswald. Yes. And I was using an extra light version of that font, and I used that on the titles and mostly in the text as well. And I think it's nothing too pre-described. I wanted something modern, so I didn't want something with all the little serifs and things. I wanted something that felt lightweight, because there's a lot of text. And so I used Illustrator to bring that in, and I see how it plays against the charts that I've got. And I also wanted to use a font that was similar to the fonts that I was getting from the Tableau charts. Yes. So I've got that limited list of Tableau fonts, which one am I going to use? And then can I find a font that's similar so it all feels cohesive? I don't want that clash to go, oh, this is obviously a Tableau part and this is obviously not a Tableau part. It just won't feel cohesive. So I was bringing, because I don't have the Tableau fonts in Illustrator, I was having to bring images of the Tableau fonts into Illustrator and then use Illustrator to find it. And that's where I came with the Oswald font that I felt worked quite well for it.
Yeah, I've used Oswald in the past. I think it's a free font from Google Fonts as well, which is useful for people trying to get a wider array of options, beyond the default Tableau font, beyond Arial, Calibri, Times New Roman. These are things that I think just demonstrate an extra attention or thought for detail and a consideration for readability, but also style and, as you said, professionalism. And I think that the result is a very cohesive style. So we've pretty much covered all the headline design stuff. I'm just thinking now in sort of reflection terms. Did you enjoy it? How do you kind of look back on this process and what you kind of feel now? There's a bit of distance. I guess it's maybe sort of 9-12 months since you sort of worked on this.
I massively enjoyed doing this project. I really did. And from the point that I was testing my own ability, could I create what I was trying to get to? Could I make it work? And each time that I was getting those little wins really, really sort of gives you that little lift and going, yeah, this is working. I can do this. And so I massively enjoyed it and pulling it together. And I'm very proud of it, and which is why I wanted something like that I could then put on the wall. I haven't put it on the wall yet because we've got stuff going on, but I've behind me on the sofa behind me, there's an actual printout of it. It's just not up yet.
Right.
So yeah, I did massively enjoy it. There's a lot there. I don't think I probably could have done it much better than what I've done.
But that's just a really nice level of satisfaction to leave a project like this, I think, to have that sense of contentment. But obviously your own views are one thing, but what would be, if you have one, a favorite comment by anybody, a favorite bit of feedback? Did anyone notice something you thought, I'm so glad you noticed that?
I can't honestly think of any sort of individual bits of feedback. It got so well received when I published it. It was just crazy. My phone notifications just went a bit crazy. So I was just massively taken back by everyone appreciating the time that I put into it. I think it was those people that took the time to look at those footnotes and dig into those as well. Yeah. That I appreciated that. And I wasn't getting the usual, sometimes you can get the comments back saying, oh, this should have been this chart, or it's too difficult to read, or anything like that. I think people were appreciating that you just got to spend, it's a piece that you need to spend a little bit of time to understand and spend in looking at it. So there's not one piece of feedback that I got, I don't think, that I can sort of jump on. But it was just overall, I think I really appreciated the people that were taking the time to look through everything.
Yeah, to actually use it and to get things from it. I think that's that's the biggest or the greatest testament to any work, is people actually got something from it. So, and I certainly got something from it, and I got a lot from this conversation, Sam. So thank you ever so much for your time and your contribution today. And thank you to everyone out there for tuning in. We'll see you soon on another episode of Explore, Explain. See you then. To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing, and spreading the word. See you next time.